The Panhead came off the ground at 20 past 10 on a Saturday morning, hooked onto the frame rail by a length of chain and lifted by a winch that had been built to drag wrecked cars out of ditches. 63 years of somebody's life going up into the air sideways, the front wheel turning slow, the way a wheel turns when there is nothing under it touching the earth anymore. The tank scraping the steel deck of the wrecker and leaving a long silver line through paint a man had laid down by hand in a shed in 1994. 20-year-old Josie Callum put her hand into the strap to stop it. The strap did not stop. It took her off her feet and dragged her 4 feet across the gravel and opened a burn across her palm 4 inches long. And 22 people watched it happen through the front window of the diner across the road. And not one of them opened the door. There was an old man standing in the doorway of the coin laundry on the other side of Route 12, 68 years old, gray, canvas apron, a coffee can of quarters in his hands. He had made a promise 31 years earlier, out loud, one word at a time, standing over a grave. And he was about to have to decide whether that promise had a hole in it big enough to walk a girl through. What those 3 men did not know was who they had just walked in on. A long time ago, across 6 states, men who had done things that would keep you awake at night used to lower their voices when somebody said the word Sunday in a room. Nobody in that gravel lot had the first idea what was about to happen. Least of all, a 28-year-old named Cody Renner, who was 11 miles away in a converted bank building and who had just made the worst piece of arithmetic of his entire life. 33 hours later, 41 motorcycles would be parked along the shoulder of Route 12, in a line so straight that the state police measured it twice and could not write one single ticket. Nobody threw a punch. Not one. Stay with me, and I will walk you all the way through it. It started barely 9 minutes earlier than that. 9 minutes and a piece of cardboard. The cardboard had been leaning against a 55-gallon drum outside Callum's garage for 11 days, and the letters on it were done in black marker, in a hand that had gotten tired somewhere around the middle of the word, please. 9,000 OBO runs, please. She had written please because on the 4th day she had learned that nobody stops for a price. Josie Callum had stood next to that sign every single day for 11 days, from 8 in the morning until the light went orange, in a barn coat that had been her father's and still smelled like her father, which is to say, like cold gear oil and lava soap, and the ghost of a cigarette he had quit in 2009. She had gotten 4 offers. 3 of them were men who wanted to talk her down. The 4th was a man from Toledo with a clean trailer and a checkbook who offered her $4,000 cash on the spot. And she asked him what he was going to do with it. And he told her the truth, which was that he was going to part it out, that the tanks alone would bring $2,000 to the right person, and the rest would go in boxes. She told him no. She told him no with her chin up and her voice steady. And she stood there in the wind for 7 more days after that, with $4,000 walking away down Route 12, because her father's motorcycle was not going to end up in boxes. That is the girl. Hold on to that, because you will need it later. The wrecker came in off the highway at 11 minutes past 10 and swung wide into the gravel, so the back end came around and the tires threw stones against the roll-up door. It was a 1998 medium duty with a boom on the back and a name on the door in vinyl letters. Kestrel, Asset Recovery and Compliance. And under that, a phone number. And under that, in smaller letters, a line that said, "We make it simple." 3 men got out. The driver was 59 years old, heavy through the shoulders, a gray mustache, a ball cap gone soft at the brim. His name was Marlon Teague, and he had been pulling cars in that county for 31 years, and he did not want to be there. You could see it in how he shut his door. A man who wants to be somewhere slams the door. Marlin pushed his shut with 2 fingers and stood a second, looking at the gravel. The second man was 24, Bo Skaggs, built like somebody who had discovered the gym at 19 and had not discovered anything else since. He came around the front of the truck, already talking. The third was 22, and everybody called him Trace. And Trace had his phone out before his boots hit the ground, held up sideways, recording, because that was his job. Renner liked footage. Renner said footage was cheaper than muscle, and he was right about that. And it is worth remembering, because that footage is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Josie came out from behind the drum with her hands still in her coat pockets. She asked them what they wanted. Bo Skaggs told her they were there for the asset. She told him it was not an asset. It was a motorcycle. And it was not her father's, and it was not hers, and they could not have it. And Bo Skaggs smiled at her the way a young man smiles at a girl he has already decided is furniture. And he said, "Ma'am, everything's an asset." Here is what they did, in order. And I want you to notice the order, because the order is the whole thing. First, Trace walked past the open service door of the garage, past a Snap-on box worth $9,000, past a 2-post lift, past a welder, a compressor, a shelf of new tires, a cash drawer with $240 in it that had not been emptied since March. Past all of it. He did not touch a single thing that had money in it. He walked all the way to the back, where the light was bad, and the Panhead sat on its stand under a bedsheet with the corner tucked under the seat the way Hoyt Callum had tucked it every night of his adult life. And he pulled the sheet off and let it fall in the dirt, and he said, over his shoulder, in a voice loud enough to carry, "There she is." That is the part I want you to sit with. They walked past everything that was worth something to get to the one thing that was worth everything. That was not a mistake. That was the product. Second, they rolled it out into the gravel, and Bo Skaggs took the chain off the hook, and he did not use straps, and he did not use a wheel chock, and he did not use the ramp that was folded up on the deck of that wrecker. He ran the chain under the frame rail, up over the primary, and he set the hook on the chain, and he hit the button. And the winch, which was rated for 8,000 pounds and was being asked to lift 640, took it up like a fish. The bike came up crooked. The bars swung. The tank kissed the deck and dragged, and there was a sound, a long, thin, scraping sound about 2 seconds in length, that a certain kind of man in this audience is hearing right now in his own chest. And I am sorry about that, but you need to hear it. Third, Josie Callum ran. She got her hand into the tie-down strap that was hanging loose off the deck, the one they had not bothered to use, and she pulled. And Bo Skaggs looked right at her hand, and he yanked the strap. He did not have to. The bike was already on the deck. He yanked it because she was making the morning take longer than he wanted it to take. It pulled her off her feet. The gravel took the knee out of her jeans, and her hand came out of that strap with a friction burn across the meat of the palm, 4 inches, from the base of the thumb to the outside edge, and the skin came off in a strip, and her phone came out of her coat pocket and skidded. And Bo Skaggs put his boot down on it without even looking, casual, the way you step on something in a barn. Then he stood over her and told her that the balance was $22,400, and that the unit was being taken as partial satisfaction, and that if she had a problem with it, she could call the office. $22,400. Remember that number, and remember the other one that made it, because the other one is the whole tragedy in this story. The other one is 2,300. $2,300, borrowed in 2019, on a signature line to fix a hail-damaged roof. $2,300 is what all of this cost. Every bit of it. Across Route 12, there was a squat cinder block building with a flat roof and a sign that had lost its red, so it just said, "Coin Laundry." And behind the front glass, there were 14 washers and 9 dryers, and a folding counter with a laminate top and a percolator on a hot plate that had been going since 5:15 that morning. And in the doorway of that building stood a man in a canvas shop apron with a coffee can of quarters in both hands. And he had been standing there since the wrecker turned in, and he had not moved, and he had not spoken, and nobody in the diner had noticed him at all. He was 6 feet even, and he had been 6'2" once. Gray all the way through, cut short, cut himself in the mirror every third Sunday. Face like the side of a barn that has been rained on for 40 years. And his hands. I want to tell you about his hands, because his hands are how you would have known if you had known what to look for. They were wide across the knuckles and flat across the back, and the fingers did not lie straight, and there were 2 of them on the left that had been broken and set by somebody who was not a doctor, and the skin over all of it was soft now. That is the thing. Soft. 19 years of warm water and soap powder and folding other people's shirts had made those hands soft. And he had let that happen on purpose, and it had cost him something to let it happen. He watched them roll the sheet off. He did not move. He watched them run the chain under the frame instead of using the straps that were 4 feet away, and his jaw did one thing, one small thing, once. He watched the front wheel come up off the gravel and turn in the air. He did not move. And then he watched Bo Skaggs yank a 20-year-old girl off her feet by the hand. And he set the coffee can down on the folding counter behind him without turning around and without looking. And he came out through that door and across the road. And he did it slow. Not fast, that is important. He came across Route 12 at the pace of a man crossing to check his mail. And he did not run, and he did not shout, and he did not pick anything up on his way. 51 feet of 2-lane blacktop, and it took him about 11 seconds, and every one of those 11 seconds was a door he was giving them, and they did not walk through any of them. Marlon Teague saw him coming first. Marlon was standing by the driver's door with his hand on the mirror, and he saw an old man in an apron walking across the road toward 3 men and a 2-ton truck. And Marlon's mouth opened, and nothing came out of it. Bo Skaggs saw him second. Bo Skaggs looked at the apron and the gray hair and the soft hands, and he laughed. He laughed out loud, and he said something to Trace, and Trace turned the phone around to catch it. He stopped laughing about 4 seconds later. The old man went to the girl first. That is the part everybody misses when they tell this story around here, and they have told it wrong for years now, and he never once corrected them. He did not go to Bo Skaggs. He went past Bo Skaggs, close enough that they were shoulder to shoulder for 1 step, and he crouched down on his heels next to Josie Callum in the gravel, and he turned her hand over and looked at the palm of it, and he said, "Can you close it?" And she tried, and 2 fingers would not go, and he said, "All right." That is all he said. All right. Then he stood up. He stood up, and he faced Bo Skaggs, and he gave him a chance. He stood there 1/2 second longer than he had any need to stand there, the way a man holds a door open 1 extra beat for somebody who is not walking fast enough. And he said one thing, quiet. Put it back on the ground and drive away. And this is a Saturday nobody remembers. 16 words. That was the whole offer. And I want to be fair to Bo Skaggs here, because I'm going to be fair to everybody in this, even the ones who do not deserve it. Bo Skaggs had no way of knowing. He was 24 years old. He had been working for Kestrel for 14 months. In 14 months, he had taken 41 vehicles off people who cried, and people who screamed, and people who threw things, and one man who got down on the concrete on his knees. And not one of them had ever done anything to him. Not one. So when a 68-year-old man in a laundry apron told him to put it back, Bo Skaggs did what 14 months had taught him to do, which was to put his hand flat on that old man's chest and shove. He got his hand about halfway there. What happened next took a hair under 2 seconds, and I'm going to describe it in the order it actually happened, which is not the order anybody in that gravel lot experienced it. The old man's left hand came up under Bo Skaggs's wrist. It did not grab. It caught, the way you catch a dropped wrench against your leg. His right hand went over the top and folded the wrist back toward the forearm, and he turned, 1/4 turn, on the ball of his left foot, and Bo Skaggs's entire 230 pounds went past him and down onto the steel deck of that wrecker, face first, with a sound like somebody dropping a tailgate. And then it was over for Bo Skaggs. The old man did not hit him. He never hit him at all. He put one knee into the small of his back and folded that arm up between the shoulder blades until the shoulder was doing all the arguing. And he held it there. And Bo Skaggs made a sound that a man makes when his body has just informed him about a thing his mouth has not caught up to yet. And then everything stopped. 2 men left standing. Trace, with the phone still up, still recording, because he had forgotten he was holding it. Marlon Teague, with his hand still on the mirror. A tire iron lying on the deck 18 inches from Trace's right knee. A 20-year-old girl on the gravel, with her hand open and her palm turned up. And a bike hanging crooked off a hook, with its front wheel still turning, slow, in the air. Now, that is the part everybody wants to skip straight to. The rest of it. What he did to the other 2, and how long it took, and what he said afterward. I know you want it. I want it too. But we're going to stop right here, right in the middle of it, with that wheel still turning. Because if I give you the next 15 seconds now, you will not understand a single thing that happens in them. You will just watch an old man handle 2 young men, and you will think it is a story about being tough. It is not a story about being tough. It is a story about a man who set something down 31 years ago and spent every morning since then making sure he never had to pick it back up. And you cannot feel what it cost him to reach for it if you do not know what it was. So we are going to leave that wheel turning, and I am going to tell you about a coin laundry. The wash house opened at 5:40 in the morning. Not 6, not 5:30, 5:40, every single day, 7 days a week, for 19 years. There is a woman named Delphine Pruitt who cleaned rooms at the Ramada out by the interchange for 26 years and who caught the 5:55 bus on the corner. And in 2006, she asked a new man who had just taken over the laundry if there was any way in the world he could open at 1/4 of, because she could get one load in the washer before her bus and get it in the dryer on her way home, and that would save her a Sunday. And he did not say yes, and he did not say no. He just opened at 5:40 the next morning, and the morning after that, and he never mentioned it again. And he was still doing it 19 years later, 6 years after Delphine Pruitt retired, and 4 years after she died. That is the kind of thing you need to know about him. nobody ever thanked him for it, because after about the third year, nobody remembered it had ever been any other way. It was simply how the place ran. The building smelled like soap powder and hot lint and a little bit of bleach, and under all of it, faint, coffee, because there was a percolator on a hot plate at the end of the folding counter, and it went on at 5:45, and it did not go off until he locked up. There was a stack of foam cups next to it, and a sugar jar and a spoon on a string, and there was no sign, no cup, no honor box, no price. It was free because it had never occurred to him to make it not free. He poured. That was the thing he did. He did not ask people if they wanted one. He would be folding a stranger's fitted sheet, which he could do in about 9 seconds, and which is a thing almost nobody alive can do. And somebody would come in at 6 in the morning off a night shift with a duffel bag and a face like a wet paper sack, and by the time they got their quarters in the slot, there would be a foam cup sitting on the folding counter next to their machine with the steam coming off it. He never said anything. He never looked up for the thank you. Half the people who got one never figured out where it came from. There is a kind of kindness that needs to be seen in order to happen, and there is another kind, and the second kind is rarer, and it is the only kind worth anything. His name was Wade Coburn, and he was 68 years old, and he had been running that laundry for 19 years, and in 19 years the town of Halstead, population 4,100, had learned exactly 3 things about him. He opened at 5:40. He did not talk much, and he would not, under any circumstance, for any amount of money, work on a motorcycle. That third one was known but not understood. Bud Faraday tried in 2011. Bud had a shovel head with a persistent oiling problem and no money, and he had heard from somebody that the laundryman knew engines, and he came in and asked, and Wade said no. Bud pushed a little, the way you do, and Wade said no again, the same way, no different, no louder, and Bud got a look at something in the man's face for about 1.5 seconds that made him stop pushing and go home. Bud told that story for years afterward, and he could never explain it. He would say, "I don't know, boys, he just went." And somebody would say, "Went where?" And Bud would say, "That's the thing. Nowhere. He just went." He was big in a way that had nothing to do with size. There were 4 or 5 men in that town who were physically larger. It did not matter. When Wade Coburn walked into the Halstead Feed and Hardware, the volume in that building came down about 15%, and not one person in there could have told you why. And if you had suggested to them that it was happening, they would have laughed at you. Quiet, mostly. But when he spoke, people leaned in without meaning to. Leaned in, physically. You could watch it happen. Behind the change machine, in a black frame with dusty glass, there was a photograph. It had been there since 2006. It was a black and white shot, or maybe just old color that had given up, of 9 men standing on a bridge in the rain. You could not see faces well. You could see that they were standing in a line, and that they were not smiling, and that whoever took the picture had taken it from too far back. Down at the right-hand end of that line, there was a boy of about 15, holding a helmet that was too big for him, with both hands against his stomach, like it might get away. Somebody in 1990 asked what the picture was. Wade said, "Some people I knew." And that was the last time anybody asked for 35 years. Under the folding counter, screwed to the underside of a laminate with 4 lag bolts, there was a gray steel box about the size of a lunch pail with a keyed latch. He checked it every single morning at 5:42, after he flipped the breaker on the water heater and before he started the coffee. Put his hand flat on the lid, pulled once against the latch, and moved on. 19 years. 6,900 and some mornings. He never once opened it. He never once needed it. It sat under there year after year, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Now, Josie. She came in on the 11th of March at 20 of 6 in the morning, 2 days after they put her father in the ground, and she stood inside the door with her arms crossed hard over herself, and she did not say anything, and she did not have any laundry. And Wade Coburn looked at her one time, and then went back to what he was doing. And about 2 minutes later, there was a foam cup of coffee on the folding counter, and he had gone into the back. She was 20 years old, and she had been running the front of Callum's garage since November, since the diagnosis, which is to say, she had been answering the phone and taking the money, and telling men who had known her since she was in a car seat that her daddy would call them back for 4 months, while her father got smaller in the recliner in the back office. Her mother had left when she was 9, and had sent a card once from Bowling Green. And Josie had learned early, the way some kids learn early, that you do not hand over the soft part of yourself to somebody just because they are standing there being nice at you. She was sharp. She was the sharpest person in that building most days, including the man who owned it. And she did not trust easy. And she was right not to. She came back the next morning, and the morning after. On the 4th morning, Wade Coburn handed her a key on a bent paper clip and a folded canvas apron and said, "Drop off service, I'm behind." That was the entire conversation. He did not ask her if she needed work. He did not ask her about her father. He did not ask her one single question about herself in the whole first month. And after about the 2nd week, she understood that he was never going to. And that was when the top of her chest came unlocked, about a half an inch. He paid her in cash on Fridays, always $11 more than the hours came to. And when she called him on it the first time, he told her the math was the math. She counted it herself the next week, and it was $11 over again. She never brought it up again either. He never raised his voice at her one time in 7 months. Not once. Not when she put a red shop rag in with the hotel's white bedding and turned $900 of somebody's linen the color of a peach. He looked at it. He said, "Well, that's a shame." And then he showed her how to strip it back with a soak and a second run, and they got most of it, and it cost him $200 out of his own pocket to make the hotel whole, and he never told her that part. She found out 4 years later. And in the corner by the front window there was a yellow plastic chair. He sat in it for about 20 minutes every afternoon around 2, when the machines were mostly quiet, with his back to the wall and his eyes on the glass and the road beyond it, and he sat in it the way a man sits down in a chair he built himself. Nobody else ever sat in that chair. There were 6 other chairs. Nobody could have told you why they did not sit in that one. Now, Halstead. You have to understand what had happened to Halstead, or none of the rest of it makes sense. The stamping plant on the North End closed in 2011 and took 410 jobs with it, and the town did what towns do, which is not die, but thin. Halstead Savings and Loan, which had been on Delaney Street since 1922 and had a mural of a wheat field in the lobby, held on until 2023 and then folded. And when a bank like that folds, the loans do not disappear. They get bundled. They get sold, in a lot by the pound, for cents on the dollar, to whoever bids. And in the spring of 2024, a 27-year-old named Cody Renner bought one of those bundles. And that is how a hail-damaged roof in 2019 turned into a chain under a frame rail on a Saturday morning. Let me tell you about him now, because I have been fair to Bo Skaggs, and I am going to be fair to Cody Renner too. And being fair to him is going to be harder for you than it is for me. He was 28, medium height, thin through the shoulders, dark hair he had cut every 2 weeks at a place in the city that charged him $60. He wore a quarter zip, always, gray or navy, tucked over a collared shirt, and good boots, and he had one visible marking, which was a burn scar across the back of his right hand, about the size of a playing card, shiny, from a friar at 16. He was aware of it. He turned that hand palm up more than a man naturally does. And he had a smile that never made it as far as his eyes. Not a cruel smile. That is what people get wrong. It was a customer service smile. It was the smile of a man who had learned at some point that the smile was a tool that went in a certain slot, and he used it the way you use a flathead, and it did not have one thing to do with whether he was happy. Here is his wound, and it is a real one. In 2009, when Cody Renner was 11 years old, a man came to his family's kitchen table at 7 in the evening about a truck. Del Renner, his father, was a forklift mechanic who had been out of work for 9 months. The man had a folder. The man was pleasant. And Del Renner sat at his own kitchen table in his own house and signed 9 pages of a payment plan that the man had brought. And when it was done, Del Renner stood up and shook that man's hand and thanked him. Thanked him. And the man took the truck anyway, 11 weeks later. Cody Renner sat on the stairs and watched his father say thank you to a man who was taking his truck. And something in that boy went hard and stayed hard. And the lesson he took out of it was not the one he should have taken. The lesson he should have taken was that the man with the folder was a coward. The lesson he took was that his father had been on the wrong side of the folder. That is all. That is the whole thing. That is how Kestrel Asset Recovery and Compliance got born, in a rented office over a nail salon in 2022. And he was good at it. I have to tell you that, too. He bought paper nobody else wanted for 4.5 cents on the dollar. He was patient. He did not chase people who had nothing, because people who have nothing are expensive. He chased people who had one thing, one truck, one boat, one roof, one motorcycle under a bedsheet. And the second piece of the business, the piece that actually made the money, was the compliance agreement. $340 a month. That is what it cost. What you got for your $340 was a laminated card in your window that said, "This business is in compliance with Kestrel standards." And what you actually got was that nobody put sugar in your tank, and nobody kicked your sign over, and nobody parked a wrecker across your entrance at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. It was never said out loud, not once. There is not a single recording anywhere of anybody at Kestrel saying the thing plainly, and their lawyer would tell you that, and their lawyer was right. And it did not matter in the end. 31 businesses on Route 12 and Delaney Street signed. 31 out of 33. $10,540 a month for doing nothing at all. Nobody fought it. Fighting it got your windows broken. Or worse. He built it on fear instead of respect, because fear was faster. And that is not a slogan, that is a business decision. And he made it consciously at 25 years old, sitting in a rented office over a nail salon. And it worked for 3.5 years. And it was going to keep working, right up until a Saturday morning in October. Now here is the visit. This is May, 5 months before any of this. Cody Renner came into the wash house at 4:20 in the afternoon with a folder under his arm and 2 men behind him who stayed by the door. He was one of the 2. 31 had signed, and 2 had not. And the other one was a Vietnamese woman named Trang, who ran the nail salon underneath his own office, and who had told him no in a language he did not speak, and had then simply gone on not signing, week after week, with a stubbornness he found genuinely bewildering. And the second one was a coin laundry, with 14 washers that grossed maybe $41,000 a year. He did not need it. He wanted it. There is a difference, and the difference is what killed him. He came in, and he looked around, and he said something pleasant about the smell. Then he set the folder on the folding counter, and he opened it and turned it around, which is a thing salesmen do, and he laid one finger on the signature line. And he made the offer, and I want you to hear the offer exactly, because it was a good offer, and it very nearly worked. He said, "I know you know the Callum girl." He said the estate has a balance of $19,400, and that balance follows the asset, and that it is going to eat that garage and everything in it, and there is not a thing anybody can do about it, because it is legal, because it is paper, because a man signed it. And then he tapped the line under his finger and he said, $340 a month, 12-month term, and I zero the Callum file this afternoon. Now think about that for 1 second. That is a girl's whole life, handed across a laminate counter, for $4,080 a year. And Wade Coburn was standing there with a stack of somebody's towels in his arms. He set the towels down. He squared the stack with the side of his hand, which took about 2 seconds, and he did that first, before anything else. And if you had known him, you would have understood that the towels being square was not a stall. It was just that the towels were going to be square. Then he poured a cup of coffee out of that percolator and set it on the counter next to the folder, in front of Cody Renner, who had not asked for one. And then he said his word. No. That was it. One word. No explanation, no argument, no counteroffer, no speech about principle. Most people telling Cody Renner no said it with their voice shaking, and he had a whole set of things he said to a shaking voice, and every one of them worked. Wade Coburn's did not shake at all. It came out flat and level and about as loaded as a man saying his own address. And the room went still. Josie was in the back by the folding table, and she stopped moving entirely. The two men by the door looked at each other, and in that stillness the only thing anybody could hear was dryer number 6, which had a pair of coveralls in it with a brass zipper, and that zipper came around and hit the drum every second and a half. Tick, tick, tick. Nobody said a word for 11 seconds, and that zipper went around 7 times. Cody Renner's smile flickered like a candle catching a draft it had not seen coming. He closed the folder. He said, "All right." He said, "I'll leave this with you." And he did not leave it. He took it, which tells you he had come apart a little more than he wanted anybody to know. And he stopped at the door, and he turned around, and he said the sentence he had said 40 or 50 times before, and it had never once failed him. He said, "Everybody signs eventually." And the old man behind the counter said nothing at all, and picked up the towels. The coffee sat there on that counter and went cold, and Josie threw it out at closing. She came up to him after, and she was scared, and her fear came out sideways as anger, which is how 20-year-olds do it. She said, "Why didn't you just sign it?" She said, "It's $300. You make that in a week. That's my dad's shop. Why didn't you just sign it?" And Wade Coburn looked at her for a while, and then he said the reassuring thing, which was also a half-truth, which was also the only lie I am aware of him telling in this whole story. He said, because he'd come back in a year, and it'd be 600. He said, "It'll blow over. Don't lose sleep." She believed that, mostly. But somewhere underneath the calm Wade Coburn understood exactly what kind of storm was rolling toward that road. And what he did not tell her was that he had made his decision the moment Cody Renner walked back out that door. He only hoped it would not actually come to that. It came to that. So, now you know the man, and you know the town, and you know the boy with the folder. But you still do not know the one thing that makes the rest of it land. And I am going to make you wait a little longer for the gravel lot, because we have to go back to 1994, and to a bridge in 1981, and to the reason a 68-year-old man will not touch a motorcycle. The photograph behind the change machine was taken on the Ashby Bridge over the Tolliver River on the second Sunday of October 1981, in the rain, by a man named Preacher Ellsworth, who was not a preacher, and who was using a camera he had borrowed and did not understand. That is why it is taken from too far back. That is why you cannot see the faces. He stood too far away because he was nervous. And he was nervous because of what was happening on that bridge. And what was happening on that bridge was that 9 outfits that had spent 19 months moving toward a war were standing in the rain, agreeing not to have one. There were 9 men on that bridge with authority to agree to it, and there was a boy of 15 who was there because his uncle had brought him, and because somebody had to hold the helmets. It took 4 hours. There was no lawyer. There was no paper, not really.
What there was, at the end of it, was 9 round patches, 4 inches across, that a woman named Ruthie Coburn cut out of white canvas on her kitchen table with a pair of shears and sewed a single black bar across the middle of, freehand, because somebody had said the word bridge, and that was the best she could do at 9 o'clock at night. 9 of them. Not 10. 9. On the back of each one, in 9 different hands, in ballpoint and laundry marker and what was almost certainly a paint pen, were 9 names. And what that patch meant, and everybody in 6 states who mattered knew what it meant inside of a year, was this: the man carrying that goes where he wants. He is not touched. He is not stopped. He is not questioned. And anybody who touches him is not answering to one outfit. He is answering to all 9. And the 9 have already agreed, in advance, in writing, in the rain, on a bridge. That is not a membership. That is not a rank. It was a piece of infrastructure. It was the closest thing that world ever had to a bridge, which is why she put a bridge on it. And Wade Coburn was one of the 9. At 24 years old, which should tell you something all by itself. Because here is what he was. He was not a president, and he was not an enforcer, and he did not run anything, and he never in his life wore a bottom rocker. What he was, from about 1977 to about 1994, was the thing that came after talking. When 2 outfits got to the edge of it, when the young ones were already sharpening things and the old ones could feel the arithmetic going bad, somebody would make a phone call. And about a day and a half later, a man would come. And he would walk into a room with 40 men in it, unarmed, alone, having told nobody he was coming. And he would stand there. And that was frequently the entire event. The story Marlon Teague eventually told, which we are going to get to properly, was Fort Wayne in 1983. 2 outfits, a garage on Coliseum, 41 men, and a thing had happened over a girl and a car that was going to cost about 9 lives before it was finished. Wade Coburn came in through the side door at midnight by himself. There were 4 men between him and the middle of that room, and it took him 9 seconds to be in the middle of that room. 9 seconds, maybe 10. Nobody died.
That is the part people cannot hold in their heads. Nobody died. 2 collarbones and a knee, and a man who never got full rotation in his neck again. And 41 men who had come there to start a war went home, and the whole thing was over. And that is why they lowered their voices. Not because he killed people, because he did not, and because everyone understood that this was a decision he was making, fresh every time, and that it was the only thing standing between the room and the other outcome. There is nothing in this world more frightening than a man who is choosing. They called him Sunday. There are 3 explanations, and I have heard all 3. One is that the bridge agreement was signed on a Sunday. One is that he only ever showed up on the 7th day, which is not true, but it is the version people like. And the third one, the one I believe because it is the one Ruthie used, is that Sunday is the day everything closes. Ruthie. Ruth Ann Coburn. Everybody called her Bird, and nobody alive remembers why. Not one person. Her own sister could not tell you. She was 5'1". She married him in 1979 in a courthouse in Bellefontaine with 2 witnesses off the street, and she was the only human being who ever told Wade Coburn no and made it stick. And she did it about 9 times a year for 15 years. She ran an alterations business out of the front room. She kept her scissors on a nail. She had a way of listening to a thing he had done all the way through, without moving her face, and then going back to the machine. They did not have children. There was a reason for that, and it is not mine to tell, and he never told it to anybody either, not even to Josie, not in 31 years. On the 14th of June, 1994, at 4 in the afternoon, a man named Charlie Frame, 46 years old, 3/4 of a pint of bourbon into a Tuesday, put a 1986 3/4-ton pickup through the front of the Blue Hen Diner on Route 12 at approximately 40 miles an hour. He did not brake. There were 6 people inside. 4 of them walked away. One of them spent 9 days in Columbus and came home. And one of them was a 5'1" woman named Ruth Ann Coburn, who had gone in for a piece of pie at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, for no reason at all. And she died at the scene, under the counter, and it was quick. And I'm going to say that, and leave it. Wade Coburn was 310 miles away in Michigan, in a room, standing between 2 groups of men who were about to do something stupid to each other over a debt of $9,000. He was doing the thing he was for. He got the call at 9:40 that night. He drove all night and got there at 5:20 in the morning, and the diner was still taped off, and there was glass all over the sidewalk, and it was already light. Charlie Frame ran. He had a brother in Kentucky and 11 days of a head start on a state that was not looking very hard. It took Wade Coburn 11 days to find him. And I want to be precise about this because the precision is the whole point. He found him in 11 days, working alone, with no computer, with a road atlas and a spiral notebook and 41 phone calls. And he found him in a fish camp outside Cadiz, Kentucky, at 4 in the morning on the 25th of June, asleep in a chair with the television on. And he stood there. That is what happened. He stood in that room for a long time. He never told anybody how long, and he told the whole rest of it once, out loud, 31 years later, in a laundromat to a 20-year-old girl. He said the television was showing an infomercial about a food dehydrator. He said Charlie Frame had a dog, a little brown thing, and it came over and put its head on Wade's boot, and he had to move his foot. And he said, out loud, into that laundromat, the sentence that I think about more than any other sentence in this entire story. He said, I had him for about a minute and a half, and then I thought, Bird's going to hear about this. Present tense. birds going to hear about this? 11 days after she died. That is what 40 years of loving somebody does to a man's grammar. He left. He drove to a gas station in Cadiz, and he called the sheriff's office in this county from a payphone, and he gave them the address of a fish camp, and he hung up before they asked his name. And Charlie Frame was arrested at 9 that morning and did 11 years and died in 2015 of something in his liver. Wade Coburn drove 11 hours back, and he went to the cemetery on the hill behind the Methodist church, and he stood at a grave that did not have a stone on it yet, because the stone was 5 weeks out. And he made a promise, and he made it out loud, and he made it one word at a time, with a pause between every single word, because he had learned somewhere along the way that a promise made fast is a promise made to yourself, and a promise made slow is a promise made to somebody. He said, "I will not be that again." 6 words, and it took him about 15 seconds to say them.
And then he stood there a while longer. And then he added the condition, because he was an honest man, and he knew himself. And a promise you cannot keep is worse than no promise at all. He said, unless it is for somebody who cannot. That is the whole thing. That is the entire architecture of the next 31 years of a man's life. Not for money, not for pride, not for a name, not for a debt, not for an insult, not for himself. Only for somebody who cannot. And for 31 years, nobody could not. That is the miracle of it, if you want to call it that. For 12 years, he drove a truck, and then he came back and buried his mother and inherited a cinder block building, and he opened it at 5:40 in the morning, and he poured coffee for people who did not ask, and in 31 years, not one single situation arose in which somebody in front of him could not handle their own trouble. He checked that steel box every morning for 19 years, and the reason he checked it was not that he thought he would need it. He checked it the way you check that the extinguisher is still on the wall. Now, the Panhead, 1962 FL, and it had been his since 1976, and he had put somewhere north of 200,000 miles on it, and Ruthie had ridden on the back of it to her own wedding with her shoes in her lap. And in August of 1994, he took it out behind his mother's place and got a can of gas and stood there with it for a while, and then did not do that. And instead, he loaded it in a truck and drove it to the scrapyard on Delaney Street. And the scrapyard was closed because it was Sunday. And a 28-year-old man named Hoyt Callum was walking past on his way to somewhere else and saw the whole thing. Hoyt Callum was the boy in the photograph, the one with the helmet that was too big for him. He had been 15 years old on that bridge, holding helmets, and Wade Coburn had taught him to ride in 1980 on a field road with a fence post as a marker, and had never once in the following 45 years told a soul that he had done it. Hoyt got in the truck. Hoyt would not get out of the truck, and they sat in the parking lot of a closed scrapyard for 2 hours. And at the end of it, Hoyt Callum drove that motorcycle away, and Wade Coburn let him. And neither one of them ever put it in Hoyt's name, and neither one of them ever discussed that fact out loud one time in 31 years. Wade kept the title in a steel box under a folding counter. Hoyt kept the bike running and clean and under a sheet with the corner tucked. It was never a loan, and it was never a gift, and there was no word for it, and they did not need one. Which brings us back to a gravel lot with a wheel turning in the air. All right, 2 men standing, Bo Skaggs face down on the deck, Josie on the ground with her palm open. And the thing you have to understand about what happened next is that Wade Coburn did not want it. Every single thing he did in the next 15 seconds, he did in the shortest possible way,
which is not the same thing as the most violent way, and is frequently the opposite. Trace went for the tire iron. He got his hand on it. He got it about 8 inches off the deck of that wrecker. Wade Coburn stepped in and put his left forearm across Trace's chest and walked him backward 3 steps into the side of the truck, and the back of Trace's head hit the fender panel, and the tire iron came out of his hand and hit the gravel. And Wade caught the boy's wrist on the way down and turned it, and Trace went to his knees. And Wade let him go. He let him go immediately. He stepped back 1 full pace and stood there with his hands down at his sides. 9 seconds, maybe 10.
That is what the whole thing took, both of them, start to finish. And there is footage of it, because Trace Wilder never stopped recording, and the phone was lying on the gravel, pointed sideways at the sky for the last 4 seconds of it. Marlon Teague never moved. He stood at the driver's door with his hand on the mirror the entire time. Wade looked at him, and Marlon looked back and put both his hands up about waist-high, palms out, and shook his head 1 time, slow. And that was a whole conversation between 2 men who had never met. Then Wade Coburn went and crouched down next to Josie Callum again. And this is the part I want you to hold on to more than the 9 seconds, because the 9 seconds is the least interesting thing that happened in that gravel lot. He tended to her before he did 1 single other thing. Bo Skaggs was still on the deck of that truck making noise. Trace was on his knees in the gravel. Neither one of them existed. He turned her hand over and looked at the burn and said, "It's going to want washing, and gravel's the worst thing for it." And he took her under the elbow, not the arm, the elbow, the way you help somebody who you have decided is not going to be embarrassed about being helped, and he got her up. Then he went to the winch. He did not ask anybody. He put his hand on the control, and he brought that motorcycle down onto the gravel about as gently as a thing that heavy can be brought down. And he took the chain off the frame rail himself, and he walked it back across the lot and set it on its stand, and put the stand down with his boot and stood there for 1 second with his hand on the seat. 1 second. That is all he gave it. And then he went and got the bedsheet out of the dirt. He shook it out. He shook a bedsheet out in the middle of all that. And he put it back over that motorcycle, and he tucked the corner of it under the seat, the way Hoyt Callum had tucked it every night of his adult life. And he had never once been in that garage to watch him do it. And he did it right anyway, because that is how you tuck a sheet. Then he swept up. There is glass in this story, and it starts here. When the winch cable had come tight, it had whipped and taken out the bottom pane of the garage's front window, a section about 2 feet by 3, and there was glass all over the gravel and up onto the concrete apron. Wade Coburn got the push broom from inside the service door and swept it into a pile himself, and then went and got a dustpan and got down on 1 knee, 68 years old, and got the pile into the pan and dumped it in the drum. He did not ask them to do it. He did not make them do it, which he absolutely could have. He just did it. And then he walked over to the wrecker where Marlon Teague was helping Bo Skaggs sit up on the deck. And he stood there until Marlon looked at him, and he said the message. He said, "Take them and go." And Marlon said, "Yes, sir." And Wade said, "Tell him the bike stays." And Marlon said, "Yes, sir." And Wade said, "Tell him nothing else." And then Marlon Teague, 59 years old, 31 years pulling cars in that county, stood there with his hand on the door of his own truck and asked the question that started the second half of this story. He said, "Mister, what's your name?" Wade Coburn did not answer.
He had already turned around. And it was Josie who answered, from over by the drum, with her hand wrapped in the tail of her father's barn coat. And she said it the way you say a thing you have said 1,000 times, without ever once hearing it. She said, "That's Wade." And Marlon Teague said, "Wade what?" And she said, "Coburn. Wade Coburn." And the color went out of Marlon Teague's face. Not slow. It went out of him like water out of a pulled drain, and he had to put his hand back on the mirror, and he stood there with his mouth slightly open, looking at the back of a 68-year-old man in a canvas apron, walking across Route 12 toward a coin laundry with a push broom in his hand. And Josie Callum saw it happen, and did not understand one thing about what she was looking at. They left. The wrecker pulled out and went east, and it went slow, and it did not throw one single stone. They spent the rest of that morning on the burn. He put her in the yellow chair by the window, which she noticed, and which she thought about for years afterward. And he ran her hand under the utility sink in the back for 4 full minutes, with the water as cool as it would go. And then he got a first aid kit out of the storage room that had a Ohio Bell sticker on it, from probably 1980, and had been restocked recently, which she also noticed. And he laid a non-stick pad over it and wrapped it in gauze in the manner of a man who had wrapped a lot of things in gauze. And then he poured her a cup of coffee she had not asked for and set it on the arm of the chair. She said, "They're coming back." He said, "Maybe." She said, "What happens then?" And he said, "Then I'll talk to him." And she said, "You didn't talk to anybody out there." And Wade Coburn almost smiled. Almost. It got about 1/3 of the way, and then it went away. And he said, "No, I didn't." At 11:40, he flipped the breaker and started a load of somebody's coveralls. At noon, a man came in with 2 bags of towels from the auto parts store. At 12:40, the mail came. At 2 o'clock, Wade Coburn sat down in the yellow chair by the front window for 20 minutes with his back to the wall and his eyes on the road. And by then, Josie had gone back across to the garage to tape plastic over the broken pane. And the whole thing had the shape of a morning that was finished. It felt over. It felt exactly like a thing that had been settled. He believed it was finished. He was wrong. The worst of that Saturday had not introduced itself yet. At 11 minutes past 3, the wall phone in the back of the wash house rang. It was an actual wall phone, avocado green, mounted next to the fuse box, with a cord that had been stretched out to about 9 feet by 19 years of people leaning. It rang maybe 6 times a week. And Wade Coburn wiped his hands on the apron and picked it up and said the word he always said, which was just wash house. And a voice on the other end said his full name. It said, Wade Amos Coburn. And then it said something that made him set the coffee scoop down slower than he had set anything down all day. It said, "You need to get that girl out of that building. Tonight." It was Marlon Teague. He was calling from the payphone that still worked outside the Marathon station on the East End, which he had driven 11 miles to use. And he was calling on a payphone in the year of our Lord because he had figured out in the last 4 hours exactly how much attention his own phone was getting. He talked for 1 minute and 40 seconds, and Wade Coburn said 11 words in total. And when Marlon was done, Wade said, "Why are you calling me?" And there was a pause on the line about 4 seconds long. And Marlon Teague said, "Because I was in Fort Wayne." And Wade Coburn closed his eyes. Now, Let me take you 11 miles east, to a converted bank building on Delaney Street, with a wheat field mural still on the lobby wall. And let me tell you what had happened in there in the 5 hours since a wrecker limped in with a young man holding his own shoulder. Because this is where the whole shape of the day changed. Cody Renner did not lose his temper. I want to be accurate about this. He did not throw anything, and he did not yell.
He came out of his office, and he looked at Bo Skaggs sitting on a folding chair in the lobby with his arm across his stomach, and he looked at Trace Wilder, and he said, "Walk me through it." And Trace pulled the video up on his phone and handed it over. They watched it 4 times. The 4th time, Renner slowed it down, and what he was looking at, what he could not stop looking at, was not the 9 seconds. It was the 11 seconds before the 9 seconds. It was an old man in an apron, crossing a road at the speed of a man going to check his mail, toward 3 men and a 2-ton truck, with nothing in his hands. Renner said, "Who is he?" And Trace said, "Some old guy runs the laundry." And Renner said, "No." And Trace said, "What?" And Renner said it again, quieter. "No." And that is when Marlon Teague, who had been standing in the back of that lobby by the water cooler for 20 minutes without saying one word, sat down. He did not sit down like a man taking a seat. He sort of arrived at a chair. He went the color of old paper. He took his cap off, and he turned it over in his hands, once, twice, running his thumb around the inside of the band the way you do. And he said, "Is his name Coburn?" The room got quiet. There were 9 men in that lobby. Renner said, "What?" Marlon said, "Is his name Wade Coburn? Is he about 6 foot, gray, hands like a couple of catcher's mitts?" And Trace said, "I don't know his name." And Marlon said, "Ask the girl." And somebody said the girl said Coburn, and Marlon Teague put his cap back on his head, and then took it off again, immediately, which is a thing a man's hands do when the rest of him has stopped issuing orders. Cody Renner said, "All right. Who is he?" And Marlon Teague looked around that lobby at 9 men, and 7 of them were under 30, and he understood that he was about to tell a story to a room full of people who had no equipment to hear it with. And he told it anyway. He said, "In 1983, I was 17 years old, and I was in a block garage on Coliseum Boulevard in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with about 40 other men, and it was going to be a bad night." He said, "I had a piece of pipe in my hand." He said, "I want you to understand what 41 men in a garage at midnight with the doors down actually looks like, and none of you do, and I'm not going to be able to fix that." He said, "A man came in the side door, alone, nobody with him. Nobody knew he was in the county." He said, he did not have anything in his hands. He said, 4 of us went at him, and it took 9 seconds, and then he was standing in the middle of that floor, and the whole room could see him, and he stood there, and he did not say one word. And somebody in the lobby, one of the young ones, laughed, actually laughed, and Marlon Teague looked at him, and Marlon said, "Nobody died." And the kid said, "So?" And Marlon Teague stood up out of that chair and said it again, and this time it came out of him like something tearing. He said, "Nobody died." He said, 41 men came to that garage to kill each other, and every single one of them went home, and nobody died. And I have thought about that for 42 years. He said, "Do you understand
What has to be true about a man for that to be the outcome? He said, he could have. Any of it. Any of us. And he chose. He stood there in the middle of 41 men and chose. And everybody in that room watched him choose. And that is why I have not touched a piece of pipe since 1983. And then Marlon Teague said the sentence that did the actual damage. Cody Renner said, "That was 40 years ago. He is 68 years old. He runs a laundry. What has he got?" And Marlon Teague stood there in the middle of that lobby with his cap in his hands. And he said, "I do not know." And that was so much worse than a number.
Renner said, "What does that mean?" And Marlon said, "It means I do not know who is left, and I do not know who would come, and neither do you. And I am telling you right now that I would not bet this building on it." He said, "There were 9 of them." He said, "That is all I am going to say, because that is all I know, and I have not been in that world since Reagan. There were 9. And if he still has what he had, then it is not 9 men, it is everybody the 9 can call. And I could not put a number on that in 1983, and I sure cannot put one on it now." You want to know how you actually destroy a man like Cody Renner? You do not threaten him. You hand him an unknown. Because everything he had built, every dollar of it, ran on certainty. He knew what a truck was worth. He knew what a lien was. He knew what people did when you took a thing off them, because he had a spreadsheet with 41 rows in it, and every row said the same thing. And now, a 59-year-old wrecker driver had put a hole in the middle of the spreadsheet and written, "I do not know," in it. So here's the thing that people who tell this story around Halstead always get wrong. They say Renner went after Wade Coburn because he was angry. He was not angry. He was scared. And scared is more dangerous. And this is the part where I need you to think like a man running a business, and not like a man watching a movie. 31 compliance agreements. $10,540 a month. Every single one of those 31 businesses was going to hear about that gravel lot by Sunday. Halstead is 4,100 people. 22 of them watched it through a diner window. And what those 31 businesses were going to hear was not a fight story. What they were going to hear is that a 68-year-old man told Kestrel no in May, and nothing happened to him, and then told Kestrel no in October, and put 2 of them on the ground and swept up his own glass, and nothing happened to him. And then Trang at the nail salon does not pay in November, and then the tire place, and then the Blue Hen. And then it is over. And it is over inside of 90 days. And Cody Renner is 28 years old with a leased building and a payment on 2 wreckers and a portfolio of paper that is worth 4.5 cents on the dollar, unless people are afraid of him. So it stopped being a collection. It became a cleanup. That is the sentence. That is the whole hinge of this thing. And it turns at about 4:30 on a Saturday afternoon in a converted bank lobby. And it turned on arithmetic, and not on temper. He made the calls himself. He got 11 men, 9 from the payroll and 2 he had to pay for from the city. And it cost him $900. And the fact that he was willing to spend $900 is how you know he had stopped thinking about money entirely. 2 wreckers and a van. And the inventory, which came out of a locker in the back of that building, was 3 aluminum bats, a 4-foot pry bar, 2 lengths of log chain, and a can of bear spray that one of them had bought at a farm store and that nobody ever used. And one more thing, which Cody Renner put in the pocket of his quarter zip himself. At about 6 o'clock,
standing alone in his office, and which nobody else in that building knew about. A 9mm pistol that his father had bought in 1996 and that had been in a shoebox since 2009. He did not intend to use it. I want to be extremely clear about that, because it matters at the end. He put it in his pocket the way a man puts a spare key in his pocket. Marlon Teague watched the trucks get loaded from the window of the lobby, and then he walked out to his own vehicle and drove 11 miles west to a marathon station and put a quarter in a payphone.
That is what he did with it. 59 years old, 31 years in that county, a wife and a grandson, and 11 years to go on a house. And he made the call anyway. And he did not tell one living soul he had made it for 4 months. Back at the wash house, it was 3:13 in the afternoon, and Wade Coburn hung up an avocado green telephone and stood there for a second with his hand still on it. Then he picked the coffee scoop back up and finished making the pot he had been making, because it was 3:15, and the pot got made at 3:15. And then he went out front. There were 4 people in that building. A young mother with a baby in a carrier and 2 machines going. An old man named Cutter Boyle, who came in on Saturdays whether he had laundry or not. And a kid of about 17 with a bag of jerseys. Wade Coburn went to each one of them individually and said the same thing. And it was not a request. He said, "I need you to take it wet. There's no charge today." He said it to the mother, and she started to argue, and he said, "Ma'am, please." And something in the please moved her out of that building in 90 seconds flat. Cutter Boyle looked at his face and said, "What's coming?" And Wade said, "Nothing you need." And Cutter Boyle, who was 81 years old, said, "Hell," and went out to his car and sat in it in the parking lot for 6 hours. And that is how we have some of the best testimony in this whole thing. He locked the front door at 4:10 in the afternoon on a Saturday, for the first time in 19 years. Josie came across the road at 4:20 because the lights were off in the front and she thought something had happened to him. She came in through the back and found him in the storage room with a flat pry bar, taking the 4 lag bolts out of a gray steel box screwed to the underside of a folding counter. And she stood in the doorway with her bandaged hand against her chest and watched him do it. He said, "I need my truck back by 9. He said, "Take it, go to the sheriff's office in Cordell. Ask for Del Prentice by name. Do not ask for anybody else. And sit in that lobby until I come get you." And Josie Callum said, "No." Now here is where 2 people who had spent 7 months not asking each other any questions had to have the only real conversation of their entire relationship. And it lasted about 4 minutes. And it is the best thing in this story. He said, "This is not a discussion." She said, "It's my dad's shop, and it's my dad's bike, and it's my hand." And she held it up, the gauze, and she said, "You're not the only one who gets to be in this." He said, "Josie." She said, "Don't." She said, "You've never once told me what to do. 7 months, not once. And you don't get to start tonight just because you're scared." And Wade Coburn stood there in a storage room, holding a gray steel box in both hands, and told a 20-year-old girl the truth, which was not the truth she expected. He said, "I'm not scared of them." He said, "I have been doing this a long time, and there is a specific thing that happens to a man when he does it, and I do not want you in this building when it happens to me." He said, "It is not that I might lose." He said, "It is that you have known me for 7 months as a man who folds towels and pours coffee."
and in about 4 hours, I am going to be somebody else in front of you. And I would rather you did not have that." He said, "Your father saw it once. In 1981, he was 15 years old, and he saw about 9 seconds of it. And he never asked me about it once in 45 years. And that was a kindness. And I am asking you for the same one." Not out of fear for himself, because he did not want her watching him become that man again. She took the keys.
She did not say she was going to the sheriff, and she did not say she was not. She took the keys, and she got as far as the door, and she stopped, and she said, "What's in the box?" And he said, "Nothing you need tonight." And she said, "That's not an answer." And he said, "No, it isn't." And then he did a thing he had never done in 7 months, which was that he reached out and put his hand on the back of her head, just once, the way you would settle a dog or a horse, and he said, "Go on." She went. She got in that truck at 4:25, and she pulled out onto Route 12, and she drove west toward Cordell for about 200 yards, and then she pulled off into the gravel apron of the old Halstead grain elevator, which sits up on a rise about 240 yards from the wash house, and she shut the engine off and sat there and looked back down the road at a cinder block building with the lights off. 240 yards. She could see the whole front of it. She could see the parking lot and the road and the front glass. And the box was on the seat beside her. He had put it in the truck himself. Think about that for a second. He carried it out and put it on the passenger seat of that truck with his own 2 hands and told her to drive away. And if you want to know what a man is actually thinking, do not listen to what he says. Watch what he sets down and where he sets it. Meanwhile, back inside, an old man was doing the thing he had done in Fort Wayne and Kokomo, and a garage outside Peoria, and 11 other places nobody ever wrote down. He walked it. He walked the whole building at a normal pace, one time, and he counted. 2 doors. The front, glass, aluminum frame, opens out. The back, steel, opens in, on a slab step with a rail. 1 window bay across the front, 6 panes, 4 feet by 6. 14 washers in 2 rows down the middle of the floor, with a 4-foot aisle between them, bolted to the concrete, 310 pounds each. 9 dryers along the east wall. The folding counter across the back, 12 feet of laminate on a 2x4 frame he had built himself in 2007, screwed into studs. And he stood at the back of that aisle and looked down it. And he understood the room the way a carpenter understands a roof, which is to say all at once, without words. Anybody coming at him had to come up that aisle. The aisle was 4 feet wide. 4 feet is 1 man and a half. The dryers on his right were hot and running, and a man does not put his back against a hot dryer. And behind him was 12 feet of counter he had built into the studs himself. Geometry, not strength. Write that down, because in about 4 hours, it is the only reason he is alive. He checked the back door. He checked the breaker. He put a mop bucket, full, 30 pounds of water, 6 feet up the aisle on the left, where a man coming in fast in bad light would find it with his shin. He turned the front lights off and left the back lights on, which puts everything in the front of that room in silhouette from the parking lot and gives the man standing in the back 4 feet of extra warning. He did not do any of this quickly. He did it the way you check a load before a long haul. And at 8:20, he started dryer number 6, empty, except for 1 pair of coveralls with a brass zipper.
and he set it on the long cycle. He did that on purpose. I have thought about why for a long time, and I have decided there are two reasons, and I only believe one of them. The practical reason is that a running dryer is noise, and noise covers a step. The other reason is that a man who has decided to stand in an empty building and wait for 11 people does not want it completely silent in there while he does it. Then he sat down in the yellow chair by the front window, in the dark, with his back to the wall. And he waited. And he was still, and did not fidget, and did not look at a clock. And by his own account, given once, years later, to a sheriff, he did not think about the fight at all. He thought about a 5'1" woman with her scissors on a nail. 68 years old, about to be outnumbered 11-1, and still, by a wide distance, the most dangerous thing within 500 yards of that road. At 8:51 in the evening, Josie Callum, sitting in a truck at the grain elevator with the windows down because the cab had gotten stuffy, heard it before she saw it. Diesel. 2 of them, and something smaller, coming up Route 12 from the east with no hurry at all. And then headlights coming over the rise, and the sound of a great many people arriving with no intention of leaving behind anybody who could talk about it later. And that is the moment Josie Callum reached over and put her hand on that gray steel box. It was not locked. He had left it unlocked. 19 years of checking a latch every morning, and on the last day he set it on a truck seat and did not lock it. And I do not think there is anything else in this whole story that tells you more about what that man had decided. She opened it in the dark with the dome light off, because she was Hoyt Callum's daughter, and you do not put a light on in a parked truck. Inside there was a manila envelope, soft with age, and inside that a certificate of title for a 1962 Harley-Davidson FL, in the name of Wade A. Coburn, never assigned, never transferred. And stapled to it a handwritten page from 1994 in a woman's neat hand, notarized, which said in about 40 words that the machine was in the keeping of Hoyt Callum at no cost and remains the property of the undersigned. Notarized on the 9th of August, 1994. Ruth Ann Coburn had been dead 8 weeks. Somebody else had written it, and somebody else's name was on the notary stamp. And Josie sat there in the dark and did the arithmetic on those 8 weeks, and put her hand over her mouth. And under the envelope, in a folded square of white cotton, there was a patch, 4 inches across, white canvas gone the color of weak tea, a single black bar across the middle, sewn freehand, and the stitching was a little crooked at one end, where a woman's hand had gotten tired at 9 o'clock at night. And Josie turned it over. 9 names on the back, 9 different pens. One of them was in a paint pen and had gone through the fabric a little. And she did not know what she was holding. She had absolutely no idea what she was holding. She was a 20-year-old girl in a truck holding a piece of canvas. And that is when she remembered the tank. Because 11 days earlier, on the first morning she stood out there with that cardboard sign, she had done something she had done 100 times as a kid, which was to open the gas cap and look in. Because when she was 9 years old, her father used to hide a butterscotch candy in the little cup under the left cap for her to find. And on the first morning, she had opened it out of pure habit, out of grief, really. And there had been no candy. There had been scratching. On the inside of that cap, on the flat underside of it, done with a scribe in small block letters going around in a spiral, in a hand that was shaky in a way her father's hand had never been until about January. She had read it 11 days ago, and she had cried in a gravel lot for about 4 minutes. And then she had gone back to standing next to her sign, because she had thought it was a goodbye. She had thought it was just a dying man leaving something soft for his kid. It said, "Josie, not mine. Nothing owed on it." Title is Across the Road. If they ever come, walk across the road. And then under that, going around the last quarter of the spiral, 10 digits, a phone number with no name on it. 11 days. She had that in her pocket for 11 days, and she thought it was a love note. And down the road, 240 yards away, a wrecker and a van pulled into the parking lot of a coin laundry, and 11 men started getting out. They came in careful. That is the first thing Wade Coburn noticed, and it told him everything he needed to know. They did not come through that door loud. They came in with 2 men holding the door and the rest coming through in a line, and they spread along the front wall in the dark before anybody said a word, and one of them went around the outside to the back to check the steel door, and came back and shook his head. Careful means they know. Careful means somebody told them. And a man who knows is a different problem than a man who does not, because a man who does not know can be sent home. Cody Renner came in last. He came in through that aluminum door in a navy quarter zip with his hands out of his pockets, and he stopped just inside, and the 11 of them had that room a third full, and up at the back of the aisle, standing between the last washer and the folding counter with his hands down at his sides and a canvas apron still on, was a 68-year-old man. And Cody Renner talked. Of course he did. That is the whole thing about him. He talked while his men moved, and he thought the talking was the operation. And it was not. It was cover for the operation. And any one of the 9 men on that bridge in 1981 could have told him that the moment you start talking is the moment you have handed the initiative to the other man. He said the balance was $22,400. He said it twice. He said, "This is not personal." And he said, "We're going to take the unit tonight, and we're going to take the contents of that register. And then Monday, you and I are going to sit down, and you're going to sign the agreement. And then this is over." He said, "Nobody has to get hurt here." He said, "Look at yourself." He said, "You are 68 years old." And while he was saying all of that, 3 of those men were moving down the aisle, and 2 were going wide left along the wall of washers, and 1 was easing up the east side by the dryers. And what Cody Renner had actually just done, without knowing it, was announce his own formation out loud with his mouth, while his body language told a professional exactly which man in the room was the real problem. Because Wade Coburn was not looking at Cody Renner. He was looking at a man on the east side by the dryers, 36 years old, one of the 2 that cost $900, who was not looking at Wade's face. He was looking at Wade's feet. Everybody in that room was looking at his face. One man was looking at his feet. And a man who looks at your feet is the only man in the room who knows what he is doing. So he did not answer the words. He answered the spread. He went first. He crossed 9 feet, and he took the man on the east side by the dryers before that man had fully decided the fight had started. And he took him with a forearm and a hip and put him into the corner of a running dryer. And the man's air left him, and he went down onto the concrete, and he was out of it for the next 4 minutes. 1 man, gone. And then 11 became 10, and 10 men came up a 4-foot aisle. The first fight had been 9 seconds. This one was not 9 seconds. This one was a war. He put his back into the corner where the folding counter met the wall, so they could only come at him from the front, and he made every single one of them pay full price for stepping through that door. Here is what a 4-foot aisle does. It means 2 men, and the second one is not really in it. It means the bats are useless because a bat needs 3 feet of arc on either side, and they had 2. And the first man who swung one caught it on the top of a dryer, and it came out of his hands and went under a washer, and stayed there until Tuesday. It means the chains are worse than useless. It means the numbers, which were the entire reason those 11 men were brave, stopped existing about 8 feet from the counter, and every one of them had to find that out by himself, one at a time. He did not throw many punches. This is the part that people who are not there always get wrong. And there were 3 people who saw the whole thing, and 2 of them said the same thing under oath. He used his hands to move men. He turned them. He put one man into another man twice. He caught a wrist and walked it down and used the shoulder to drop the body, and the body took out the legs of the man behind it. There were 9 or 10 actual strikes in 4 minutes, and every one of them was short, 6 or 8 inches, into a place that turns a body off, and there was not one single wind-up in the whole thing. And it went on, because 10 is 10. A man came in low and got hold of his left leg, and Wade Coburn went down onto the counter on his back with a man on his leg and another one coming. And he got a heel into a collarbone and heard it go, and got back up. A chain came over the top and caught him across the left shoulder, and the whole arm went numb from the neck down to the fingers, and did not come back for a minute and a half. And he fought the rest of it with a numb arm, and did not mention it out loud until 3 years later. His body reminded him, joint by joint, that he was not the man he had been at 30. His left knee, which had been rebuilt with hardware in 1988, went out sideways twice, and both times he put it back under himself. There was a place in his lower back that stopped being a place and became a color. His lungs were gone by the second minute, entirely gone, and he was breathing in through his nose in a way that a man does when he has decided that the alternative is worse. 4 decades had taken plenty, but 4 decades had not taken the one thing that had ever actually mattered about Wade Coburn. In a fight, he simply did not stop. There was a lull. There was always a lull. About 2.5 minutes in, 6 men were on the floor or against a wall, and 4 were standing at the far end of that aisle, and nobody moved for about 9 seconds. And in those 9 seconds, the only sound in that entire building was dryer number 6, still running, with a pair of coveralls in it, and that brass zipper came around and hit the drum every second and a half. Tick, tick, tick. 10 men breathing, 1 dryer, a brass zipper. Nobody in that room forgot that sound for the rest of their lives, and 2 of them mentioned it in sworn statements without being asked. 240 yards away, a 20-year-old girl was standing on the running board of a pickup truck at the grain elevator, with a phone she had borrowed nowhere, because her phone was in 11 pieces in a gravel lot. And this is where the whole thing could have ended badly. And here is how it did not. Cutter Boyle, 81 years old, sitting in his car in that parking lot for 6 hours because a man had said, "Nothing you need." Cutter Boyle had a flip phone, and he had called the sheriff at 8:53, before the first man was out of the van. And Cutter Boyle also did the other thing, which was that when Josie Callum came running down that road on foot in the dark, he rolled his window down and put his phone in her hand without her asking. She called the number off the inside of a gas cap standing in a gravel lot in the dark, and it rang 4 times. And a woman answered. A woman, maybe 70, sounding like she had been asleep. And Josie Callum said the only thing she could think of to say, which was, "My name is Josie Callum. I'm Hoyt Callum's daughter, and I'm holding something, and I don't know what it is." And the woman on the other end said, "Describe it." And Josie said, "It's white. It's about 4 inches. There's a black line across it. and there's names on the back." And the line went absolutely silent for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a very long time on a telephone. And then that woman's voice came back, and it was a completely different voice. And she said, "Say the names." And Josie Callum stood in a gravel lot in the dark and read 9 names off the back of a piece of canvas out loud, one at a time. And she got to the 4th one, and the woman said, "Stop, stop." And then she said, "Honey, where are you standing?" Inside, the lull ended. And this is the part where everybody in that building, including the man himself, believed it was over. There was a man named Dwayne, 29, who had come in with a 4-foot pry bar and had not been able to use it in the aisle, and he had gone back up the aisle and around the far end of the row of washers and come up the other side. And he came from the left, from the blind side, from the side with the numb arm. And he swung that pry bar with both hands, and he did not swing it at the head, he swung it at the body. And it caught Wade Coburn across the ribs on the left about 4 inches below the arm. 2 ribs, both of them cracked and one of them displaced, and the sound was flat and wet and small. And the whole left side of that man's body simply quit. For one long, terrible second, the entire room tilted sideways in front of his eyes. He went down onto one knee. Both hands went to the concrete. His head was down, and he could not get air, and the floor was moving under him like the deck of something. And there were 4 men standing over him, and one of them had a chain. And out through the front glass, in the parking lot, a 20-year-old girl who had come running back up that road had her hand over her mouth and had stopped breathing entirely. And the glass was between them, the way glass always is. And she could not do one single thing. Every man left standing in that building believed they were about to watch that old man go down for good. So did that old man. He did not go down. I cannot tell you how. Nobody can. There is no mechanical explanation for what a body does when a man has already made the only decision he has left to make. He got one hand off the floor and put it on the edge of the counter. And then he got a foot under himself. And it took about 4 seconds, and every single one of those men watched him do it, and not one of them moved. And there is a reason not one of them moved, which is that watching a 68-year-old man with 2 broken ribs stand back up out of the middle of that is the single most frightening thing any of them had ever seen in their lives. He got up. He put his back in the corner again, and he said the only thing he said in the entire fight. He said, "Go home." And that is the moment the door opened again. Cody Renner had been standing by the front glass for 4 minutes, watching his $900 operation come apart in a 4-foot aisle, and he had run out of things to say around minute 2. And somewhere in that 4th minute, 28 years old, with a leased building and 2 truck payments and 31 signatures and a father who once said thank you to a man taking his truck, he put his hand in the pocket of his quarter zip. And he came up the aisle, and he raised a 9mm pistol and pointed it at a man in a canvas apron from about 11 feet. Everything stopped. A gun changes a fight. It does not matter how skilled a man is, how tough, how willing, how many rooms he has walked into alone. A gun makes all of it worth nothing at all, instantly. And every man in that building understood it in the same half-second, and 4 of them stepped backward without deciding to. The building went completely silent. And in that silence there was exactly one sound, and it was a brass zipper hitting the inside of a dryer drum every second and a half. Tick, tick, tick. Cody Renner's hands were shaking, both of them. He had it in 2 hands, and both of them were going, and everybody could see it, and he knew everybody could see it, and that made it worse. Because here's the thing about Cody Renner. He had never done this. He had never hit anybody in his life. He was a man who bought paper at 4.5 cents and sent other people to gravel lots. And he had gotten all the way to 28 years old on this earth, having never once personally crossed the line he was standing on. And his body knew it, even if his mouth did not. And Wade Coburn, standing there with 2 broken ribs and a dead left arm and blood coming down out of his eyebrow into his eye, spoke to him in exactly the same voice he had used in May when he said one word over a folder. Quiet. Level. About as loaded as a man saying his own address. He said, "Son, look at your hands." And Renner said, "Shut up." And Wade Coburn said, "If you do that, here is what happens." He said, "There are 10 men in this room, and every one of them goes to prison with you, and every one of them will tell it, because 10 men do not hold a thing like that. 10 men never have." He said, "Your father is alive." He said, "And he will be in the front row of that courtroom for 4 weeks." And Cody Renner's face came apart about 1/4 of an inch. And that was when the door opened. She came in, soaking wet, because it had started raining at 9:04, and she had been standing in a gravel lot in it. And she came in through that aluminum door, and she stopped 3 feet inside it, in the middle of everything, 20 years old, one hand in gauze, and she held a piece of white canvas up over her head in both hands. And she said, "My name is Josie Callum. My dad is Hoyt Callum." And she said, "That motorcycle you took off my property this morning was never his. It's not in his name, and it never was. And I've got the title in a truck up the road with a notary stamp on it from 1994. And you cannot attach a thing my father did not own." Not a fist, not a threat, a document. 20 years old, standing in front of a gun, leading with the law. And then she said the other thing. She said, "And I called the number my dad scratched inside the tank cap." She said, "A woman answered. And I read her the 9 names off the back of this. And she asked me how many of you there were, and I told her 11. And then Josie Callum said the 7 words that ended it. She said, "And she didn't ask me anything else." It was a bluff, and it was not a bluff. She did not know what she was holding. She had no idea whether anybody was coming, or how many, or when, or whether any of the 9 names on that canvas belonged to living men. Every bit of certainty in her voice was manufactured on the spot by a 20-year-old girl who had spent 11 days standing next to a cardboard sign learning how to hold her chin up in front of men who wanted to talk her down. And it did not matter that it was a bluff, because it was also completely true. There was a man against the wall on the left side, 44 years old, name of P.D. Vance, who had done 11 years and knew exactly one thing that nobody else in that room knew. And P.D. Vance said, out loud, into the silence, in a voice that came out about an octave off, "That's a bridge patch." And that is how the reveal landed. Not from an old man's mouth, not from a speech, from a frightened man against a wall doing arithmetic in front of everybody. Cody Renner said, "What?" And P.D. Vance said, "Put it down." And Renner said, "What is it?" And P.D. Vance said, "Man, I am telling you to put it down." And then Marlon Teague's voice came from the back of that room, because Marlon Teague was there. He had driven one of the 2 wreckers because if he had refused, they would have known. And he had spent 4 minutes standing in a doorway not touching anybody. And he said it flat and tired, the way you say a thing you have already said once today and nobody listened. He said, "That is 9 outfits, Cody." He said, "That is 9, and everybody the 9 can call." and you could watch the math land in real time. Because here is the arithmetic Cody Renner ran, standing in a laundromat at 9:11 at night with a gun in 2 shaking hands. And he ran it himself, and nobody made him. And it failed for all of them. If she was lying, he could pull that trigger and go to prison for the rest of his life with 10 witnesses. If she was telling the truth, he could pull that trigger and go to prison for the rest of his life with 10 witnesses and never make it to the county line. There was no third row. Every single road out of that room went through a place he had never once considered going. Because for 3.5 years, the business had run on the absolute certainty that nobody ever fought back. And there were 7 men on the floor of that laundry demonstrating that the certainty was gone. $2,300. That is what all of it cost. A hail-damaged roof in 2019. The gun came down first, slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument his arm had been losing for about 40 seconds. And Wade Coburn came off that counter and crossed 11 feet. And he did not snatch it, and he did not twist it out of his hand. He put his right hand over the top of that pistol, over the whole slide, and he closed his fingers on it, and he stood there and looked at that boy from about 18 inches, and he waited. And Cody Renner let go of it. That is the last physical act of this entire story. A 28-year-old man opening his hand. Wade Coburn dropped the magazine into his apron pocket, racked the slide with the heel of his numb left hand, and caught the round out of the air on the 3rd try because his fingers were not working. And then he set the 3 pieces down on that folding counter, spread out, 12 inches apart, in a row, and turned back around. And it was over. Truly over this time. They left the way people leave a funeral. Quiet, careful, nobody looking back. 6 of them could walk. They carried 2 out and helped 3, and nobody said one word. And the last one through that door was a 28-year-old in a navy quarter zip with his hands empty. And he stopped in the doorway and half turned around. And whatever he had thought of to say, he did not say it. The first cruiser came in off Route 12 at 9:19 with the light bar going and no siren. And the sheriff's department found a parking lot full of vehicles that were not leaving, because at 9:14, Cutter Boyle, 81 years old, had driven his 1994 Buick into the mouth of that parking lot, put it in park, shut it off, and put the keys in his pocket. He said afterward that he did not really decide to do it. He said his hands just did it. Sheriff Del Prentice, 31 years with that county, arrived at 9:31. He came in his own truck. He came in a flannel shirt and a ball cap, off duty, and he left his sidearm in the console. And he walked across that parking lot on foot, past 9 men sitting on a curb with deputies standing over them. And he opened the door of a coin laundry and went in alone. He had been in that building 100 times over 19 years. He had gotten a cup of coffee out of that percolator most Tuesdays for a decade. And he had also, in May, sat across a desk from a 28-year-old man with a folder and put one finger down on a page and said a version of the sentence he had been saying for 31 years, which was, "Son, you are building something you do not understand. And one of these days, my people are going to have to stand in front of it." And he had been right. And he took no satisfaction in it at all. He found the room wrecked, 2 washers off their bolts, glass out of the front door and 2 panes of the front window, and blood on the concrete in 4 places, and a dryer at the far end still running with a brass zipper going around every second and a half, because nobody had turned it off. And in the yellow chair by the front window, sitting down, was a 68-year-old man with a split eyebrow and his left arm in his lap, and a 20-year-old girl kneeling next to that chair, holding a pillowcase full of ice from the Blue Hen's ice machine, against the side of his face with her good hand. And Del Prentice took his cap off, and he said, "Amos?" That was the man's legal first name, Wade Amos Coburn. He had gone by his middle name since he was 4 years old, and there were maybe 6 people left alive who knew the first one. And Del Prentice had known it for 31 years, and had never once used it. And he used it that night, standing in a wrecked laundromat with his hat in his hand. And everybody in that room who understood what they had just heard understood exactly what it was. Wade Coburn said, "Coffee still hot, if the power held?" And it had. And a 68-year-old man with 2 broken ribs got out of that chair, over one solid objection from a 20-year-old girl, and poured a cup of coffee for a sheriff who had not asked for one. Now, the paperwork. Wade Coburn asked Del Prentice for one thing that night, and it was not what anybody expected. He asked for 24 hours. Prentice said, "I have got 9 men on a curb and a firearm on your counter, and I have got a girl with a hand injury from this morning, and I have got footage. And I do not need one word out of you to charge every bit of it." Which was true. And Wade Coburn said, "I know." And then he said, "I am not asking you to hold anything. I am asking you not to go get him tonight." And Del Prentice said the thing that goes in the middle of every story like this one. He said, "What do you want, Amos? Do you want him punished? Or do you want him to understand?" And Wade Coburn said, "Both." So, on Sunday morning, Halstead, Ohio, population 4,100, woke up to a laundromat with plywood over the front door and heard the whole thing over eggs. And by 10 in the morning, there were about 60 people who had driven past that parking lot slowly. And by noon, there were 4 versions of what had happened, and every one of them was bigger than the last. And at 4 in the afternoon on Sunday, the first 2 motorcycles came in from the west. They were not loud about it. That is the first thing everybody says. 2, and then 11 minutes later, 6, and then 9. They came in from the west and from the north, and 2 came all the way up from Kentucky, and 1 came 410 miles from Michigan, and they came in 2s and 3s over about 3 hours, and every one of them parked on the shoulder of Route 12 on the north side, front wheel to the fog line, in a line, and shut off and got off and stood. By 7:15, there were 41 of them. The State Highway Patrol sent 2 cars. A sergeant walked that line with a tape measure, because that is what you do, and he measured the distance from the fog line to the front tire on 11 of them, and every single one was between 11 and 14 inches, on the gravel, off the pavement, legal. Nobody was drinking, nobody was in the road, nobody was on private property. There was no sign, no chant, no shouting, and 9 of them were over 70 years old, and one of them was 91, and had come in a car because his hip was done, and he was not going to miss it. 2 hours, 41 motorcycles, and about 60 people on a shoulder for 2 hours, doing absolutely nothing at all, in perfect silence, obeying every single rule with a precision that was itself the entire message. That sergeant could not write one ticket. He said so out loud to a deputy in the parking lot of the Blue Hen, and it got repeated around that county for a decade. He said, "In 22 years, I have never seen anything so aggressively lawful in my life." And that is what Cody Renner drove into at 7:40 on a Sunday evening. Because he came. Nobody made him. There was no warrant yet, no call, no summons, and he could have gotten in a car and been in another state by supper. And he was 28 years old, and he drove himself back to Halstead in a wrecker with a 1962 Panhead strapped down properly on the deck, with straps on the ramp with a wheel chock. And he pulled into the gravel lot of Callum's garage in front of 41 motorcycles and about 100 people. Nobody touched him, not one hand. That is the part I need you to hear. He got out of that truck and walked the length of that deck and unhooked his own straps and ran his own ramp down and walked that motorcycle down off it by himself. And it took him about 4 minutes because he did not know how to do it, and nobody helped him. And then he set it on its stand in the gravel in front of Callum's garage, and he stood there with his hands at his sides. And then he went back to the cab and got a cardboard box. There were 31 compliance agreements in it, and Cody Renner stood in that gravel lot and read out a name and waited. And a person came out of that crowd, and he handed them their agreement and said the same 12 words to every single one of them, which were, "This is void. I am sorry. You do not owe me anything." 31 times, out loud, in front of the same town that had watched him take things off them for 3.5 years. It took 19 minutes. Trang from the nail salon did not have one, because she had never signed. And when he got to the end of the box, he went over to where she was standing and said it to her anyway. And she looked at him for a while, and then nodded once. And Wade Coburn was not there. I want you to understand that, because it is the most in-character thing in this entire account. There were 41 motorcycles and 100 people, and a public act of restitution on Route 12 on a Sunday evening, and the man it was all about was 9 miles away in an emergency room in Cordell, getting 3 stitches over his left eyebrow and refusing to let them set the ring finger on his right hand until Monday, because he did not want to be sedated on a Sunday. Josie drove him. He argued about going for 40 minutes, and she won by taking his keys. And that was the second time in 2 days that a 20-year-old girl told Wade Coburn no and made it stick. And I think there was a 5'1" woman somewhere who would have laughed out loud about that. The legal machinery, when it came all at once, and it came in one long, unbroken run. There was Trace Wilder's own footage from Saturday morning, which she had helpfully backed up to a cloud account. And there was the wash house security camera, a $40 unit over the change machine that Wade Coburn had installed in 2011 and had never once looked at, recording onto a hard drive in the storage room that had 11 days of loop on it and caught 4 minutes and 9 seconds of a Saturday night in grainy black and white, including a 28-year-old raising a firearm. There were 22 sworn statements from a diner window, and one from an 81-year-old man in a Buick, and one from a 59-year-old record driver who walked into the sheriff's office in Cordell on Monday morning by himself with a lawyer he had paid for out of his own pocket. There were GPS logs from 2 wreckers. There were 31 compliance agreements which Cody Renner had helpfully handed out in front of 100 witnesses, and which every single one of those people brought back in when the Attorney General's Consumer Division asked for them, and which laid out, in Kestrel's own filing system, 3.5 years of a protection scheme in 12-point type. There was a bank record showing a bundle of paper bought for 4.5 cents on the dollar, and a collections file showing $2,300 being called $22,400. And it went into a grand jury in January, and came out the other side as 7 felony counts and 11 misdemeanors distributed across 9 people. Kestrel Asset Recovery and Compliance was finished in 31 days. Not a year. 31 days. The lease on the bank building went first, then the wreckers, and the whole thing was gone before the ground thawed. Cody Renner took a plea and got 6 years, and served 4. Bo Skaggs got 18 months. Trace Wilder testified and got probation, and moved to Indiana, and is, as far as anybody knows, fine. And then Route 12 came back, one at a time, which is the part that is actually worth sitting with. The tire place put its own name back on its own sign in November. The Blue Hen took the laminated card out of the window and did not replace it with anything, just left the empty spot, and left it empty for years. A man named Roy Deem, who ran the small engine shop, paid off a thing he had been paying on for 2 years, and then sat in his truck in his own parking lot and did not come inside for 20 minutes. And Trang, from the nail salon under the old bank building, who had never signed, who had told a 28-year-old man no in a language he did not speak, and then simply gone on not signing for 3.5 years while every business on that road folded around her, cut her own name out of vinyl on a machine in her back room, and put it up on her own front window herself, on a Tuesday morning, on a stepladder, in the cold, in letters 4 inches high. That is the smallest thing in this entire story, and it is the one that gets me. Marlon Teague testified for 2 hours and 11 minutes. He was asked, on the stand, by a defense attorney why a man with a wife and a grandson and 11 years left on a house would drive to a payphone. And Marlon Teague, 59 years old, said, "I was in Fort Wayne in 1983, and I have had 42 years to think about which side of that room I was standing on, and I decided I did not want to spend the rest of it on the same side." Del Prentice retired the following year, with 32 years in. At his party, somebody asked him about that night, and he said one sentence about it, and then talked about fishing for an hour. And 4 years later, a letter came. It came in March, addressed to Josie Callum at Callum's Garage, from a correctional facility in Chillicothe, and it was 1 page, handwritten, and it did not ask for one single thing. It did not ask for forgiveness, and it did not ask her to write back, and it did not explain, and it did not say the word sorry more than 1 time. What it said, mostly, was about a kitchen table in 2009 and a man with a folder, and it said, "I've had a lot of time to work out which one of them I turned into, and it took me about 2 years in here to be honest about the answer." And at the bottom it said, "I do not need a reply. I just did not want it to be the last thing I ever did about it." Josie kept it. She never wrote back. She showed it to Wade one time, and he read it twice and handed it back and said, "Well?" And she said, "Well, what?" And he said, "That took some doing." And that was every word he ever said about Cody Renner for the rest of his life. Now, the bike. Josie Callum did not sell the Panhead. She could not have anyway, and that is the thing about the note that everybody in Halstead has always found funniest and saddest at the same time. She had spent 11 days in the cold trying to sell a motorcycle that was not hers to sell, to pay a debt that was not hers to pay, on a machine that could never have been attached in the first place, and the answer to all 3 of those things had been scratched inside the gas cap with a scribe by a dying man who had known exactly what was coming and had known exactly one place to point his daughter. Across the road. That is all he wrote. Walk across the road. Wade Coburn signed the title over to her in April. He did it at the folding counter with a ballpoint pen, and he did not make a speech. And when she started to say something, he said, "Your dad kept it running for 31 years. That is a purchase price." And he put the cap on the pen. She learned to ride it that summer. He would not teach her. He would not touch it, would not sit on it, would not put a wrench on it. And she asked him one time, early on, and he said no, in the same voice he had said no to a folder, and she never asked again. What he did do was stand in the parking lot of the wash house with his arms folded for about 40 hours over the course of 2 months, while a 20-year-old girl figured it out for herself on a field road with a fence post as a marker, exactly the way a 15-year-old boy had figured it out in 1980. And if you think he did not know he was doing that, you have not been listening. The first day she got it out onto Route 12 and up to speed and came back, she shut it off in that parking lot, and he did not say anything at all for a minute. And then he said, "Your father sat about 4 inches further back on that seat than you do." And then he went inside. The town let it lie. That is the thing about Halstead that I think about the most. 41 motorcycles came to that road on a Sunday evening, and the whole county saw it. And everybody understood that the old man from the laundry was connected to something. And then, over about 6 weeks, that town collectively and without any conversation whatsoever decided not to find out what. Nobody asked him. In 11 more years, not one person in that town ever asked Wade Coburn who he had been. They asked each other constantly. They never asked him. And the stories got bigger, the way they do. By about year 3, the version they told at the Blue Hen had him putting 3 men through the front window, which never happened. That window had 2 panes broken, and both of them by a chain. By year 6, there were 11 men and a shotgun. By year 9, somebody had him doing it with a broken arm, which is closer to true than the rest of it. And he never corrected any of it, not once. If somebody said, "Hey Wade, is it true about the window?" he would say, "It was a Saturday." And that was the entire answer, every time, for 11 years. And it made people crazy, and I think he enjoyed that about as much as he enjoyed anything. The wash house opened at 5:40 the following Monday morning. Plywood over the door, 1 washer missing, 3 stitches over his left eyebrow, and 2 ribs taped. 68 years old. 5:40. Josie found out later that he had been there since 4:30 because it took him that long to get the window boarded. She stayed. That is the other thing. She kept the garage going because she was Hoyt Callum's daughter, and she had been running the front of it since she was 19. And she hired a man named Perry to turn the wrenches, and she ran the business. And she was good at it. And by year 4, she had 2 lifts going. But she also had a key on a bent paperclip, and every single morning of her life, she went across the road first and unlocked a coin laundry at 5:40 and started a percolator. 11 years. Wade Coburn died on a Tuesday afternoon in the yellow chair by the front window, with his back to the wall and his eyes on the road, at 79 years old, in the 20 minutes he took at 2 o'clock. Josie found him at 20 past. There was a foam cup on the arm of the chair. It was not his. He had poured it for somebody who had not come in yet. The doctor said heart, and said it had been quick, and said he would have felt about 4 seconds of it. Half that town came to the funeral, and the other half had a reason, and a lot of them cried. And there were 9 motorcycles at the cemetery, and none of them belonged to anybody who lived in that county, and nobody asked. They put him up on the hill behind the Methodist church, in the same plot, next to a stone that had been sitting there since 1994, with a name on it and 1 word underneath it. And the word was bird. Josie Callum kept the laundry. She did not need it, and it made almost nothing, and she kept it. And she opened it at 5:40 in the morning, and it is still 5:40 right now, today, as I'm telling you this. Not because of a rule, not out of sentiment, because that is simply how the place runs. The yellow chair is still by the front window. Nobody sits in it. There are 6 other chairs. She has never once told anybody not to sit in it, and nobody ever has. And she has watched strangers walk in, look around a room with 6 empty chairs in it, and choose one of the other 5. And she cannot explain it any better than Bud Faraday could explain what he saw in a man's face in 2011. The steel box got bolted back under the folding counter with 4 lag bolts. The title is gone out of it. That went to a 20-year-old girl in April with a ballpoint pen. What is in it is a piece of white canvas, gone the color of weak tea, 4 inches across, with 1 black bar sewn freehand by a 5'1" woman at 9 o'clock at night in 1981, and 9 names on the back, in 9 different hands. She put it back herself the week after the funeral. She lifted it with both hands, the way she had taken it out of a truck seat in the dark, and she laid it in the bottom of that box, flat, and she closed the latch. And she checks it every morning at 5:42, after the water heater and before the coffee, puts her hand flat on the lid and pulls once against the latch and moves on. She has never opened it again. It sits under there, year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Because by then, everyone who needed to know already knew exactly who Wade Coburn had been, and exactly who he had chosen to become instead. Now, think back for a moment to where this whole thing started. A chain under a frame rail, a wheel turning in the air, a girl on gravel with her hand open. It looked, in that very first moment, like a mismatch nobody could survive. It looked like the strong taking from the weak in a gravel lot on a Saturday morning, while 22 people watched through a window and did not open the door. It looked like the world doing the thing the world does too often, which is to find the one person in a county with the least ability to stop it and take from them because they are the cheapest place to take from. And standing across the road from all of that was an old man in an apron, with soft hands and a coffee can full of quarters. And Bo Skaggs looked right at him and laughed. And every single thing Bo Skaggs saw was accurate. He was 68. He was gray. He did fold towels for a living. He had not thrown a punch in 31 years. All of that was true. But that is the thing about quiet men. The quiet is not weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice, made on purpose, by somebody who has already been everywhere that violence can take a person, and has decided, deliberately, at a graveside, one word at a time, to come back from it, and stay back from it. What Bo Skaggs should have seen, standing on the deck of that wrecker, was not an old man. What he should have seen was a man who had set down a very heavy thing a long time ago, on purpose, and who had spent 19 years opening a door at 5:40 in the morning to prove to himself that he could keep it set down, and who was going to pick it back up exactly one time, for exactly the right reason, for somebody who could not, and then set it down again, for good. And he did set it down again. That is the whole point. He put a pistol on a folding counter in 3 pieces, and he sat down in a yellow chair, and he poured a sheriff a cup of coffee, and he opened at 5:40 on Monday, and he lived 11 more quiet years, and died in that chair with a cup on the arm of it that he had poured for somebody who had not walked in yet. $2,300. That was the whole cost of it. A hail-damaged roof in 2019. $2,300 turned into a chain under a frame rail, and a girl's hand, and 7 men on a floor. and a young man in a quarter zip with his father in the front row for 4 weeks. Nobody got rich. Nobody won anything. The only thing that got restored in the end was a woman's own name on her own window in vinyl letters she cut herself. If any part of this landed close to home for you, and I know for some of you it will have, because there are a lot of people out there right now getting calls about old paper and being told that a number has become another number. Please know you do not have to sit with that on your own. Every state has a consumer protection office inside the Attorney General's office, and most counties have legal aid that costs nothing at all. And a debt collector who threatens you or takes property he has no right to is breaking a law that already exists and has teeth. You do not need to have it all figured out before you pick up the phone. You just have to pick up the phone. That first call is the only hard part, and somebody on the other end of it does this all day. The part of this I keep coming back to is not the 4 minutes in that laundromat. Honestly, the fight is the least interesting thing in the whole account. What I keep coming back to is a dying man in a recliner in the back office of a garage, sometime around January, getting himself up and out to a bike under a sheet with a scribe in his hand, and lying down on the concrete floor next to it so he could reach, and scratching 20 words and a phone number inside a gas cap for a daughter he knew he was not going to be there for. He did not leave her money. He did not leave her advice. He left her a direction, across the road. So here is what I would like to know from you, and I mean this one specifically, not the fight. That moment, 11 days before any of it, when Josie Callum turned down $4,000 cash in hand from a man who was going to part that bike out, and went back to standing in the cold next to a piece of cardboard with the word "please" on it. When it was still just her, and no old man had crossed any road yet, and there was no help coming that she knew about. Would you have taken the $4,000? Be honest about it. Tell me down in the comments, because I read every single one of them, all the way through, and the ones on stories like this one are the reason I keep making them. And if this is your first time here, welcome. This is a channel about the people everybody else underestimates, and about the fact that a man's quiet is usually a decision and not a defect. And we take our time getting there because these stories deserve the time. If that is your kind of thing, I would be glad to have you stay with us. Subscribe and ride along. There are 2 more stories waiting for you right there on the screen, and I picked them because they sit right next to this one. And thank you. Genuinely. Thank you for caring enough about a girl with a cardboard sign and an old man with a coffee pot to sit here with me all the way to the end of it. That means more than you know. I will see you on the next one. This story is a work of fiction. It was inspired by general themes of loyalty, dignity, and standing up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. All persons, names, businesses, organizations, places, and events depicted are entirely fictitious, and any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or to actual events, is purely coincidental. It is intended for entertainment purposes only.